Today, Mara and I are going to talk about reproducibility, specifically in the language sciences, although I think much of what we say applies to all disciplines. But our examples of focus will be on linguistics. And I'm from the University of Cologne. Mara is from the Arctic University of Norway, and it's the first time we're presenting together. So we're very excited. I'll be focusing more on what we mean by reproducibility and why we do it. And then I'll show you some examples of what some of my students have done attempting to reproduce published linguistic studies. And then Mara will talk about how we can ensure that we make our studies more reproducible, and specifically introducing trolling and how that works. So that's really exciting. We don't just focus on what's wrong, what's not going well in our discipline, but also what we can do to improve things. So that's the plan. Let's begin with what we mean by reproducibility exactly, especially as the terminology is a bit muddled up and people disagree on what it means exactly. I'll be following the terminology from the Turing Way project. And so the idea is that if we have some data, and here's the data, and we have some methods, and here are the methods, we produce some findings. And if a study is reproducible, we can take the same data, apply the same method, but it's an independent researcher applying these same methods on the same data, and we should obtain exactly the same results because we have the same data, we have the same method, so we would expect things to be reproducible. So it might seem like that's fairly obvious. If you're using the same data, you're using the same method, and of course you're going to get the same results. And so reproducibility should be a low threshold to pass. But in practice, as we'll see, it's not always that simple. Just clarifying what we mean by reproducible and how that differentiates to replicability and something being replicable. When we have different data, so new data being collected, and then the same method being applied by a different team of researchers, then we expect the results to be highly comparable, but not exactly the same because, of course, we've got different data. And that's what we mean by replicable. So with a replication study, we would expect to be collecting new data, whereas our reproductions are actually using the author's original data. And the Turing Way has this nice representation and differentiation between reproducible studies or conducting a reproduction and replication. And then we can also do robustness tests when we use the same data but apply different analysis methods. And ideally, we would like our research to be generalizable. So we would like to eventually be able to use different data, collect different data, apply different methods, and still being able to observe the same effects. And then we would say that we have something that's generalizable. And that would be ideal in the long run. But for now, we're going to focus on this first step, which is reproducibility, ensuring that if we have the same data and we apply the same methods, we get exactly the same results. That's the idea. So why do we care about reproducibility? As I said, because at least I like to see it as a sort of first step towards generalizability, and the further up we go in terms of repetitive research, the more time it takes, the more effort it takes. Of course, if we have to collect new data to conduct a replication study, then that will take a lot more time and effort than if we can apply the same, use the same data and apply the same methods as in the original study. So that's broadly across all disciplines. Linguistics as a field, and it's a very broad field, as you know, has thought about the replication crisis for a while now. This was a special issue in linguistics in 2021. And some of the conclusions from this special issue was that we have a lack of transparency in methodology and data analysis in many of our studies. Much of our research is not reproducible because, for instance, we're not sharing the original data and we're not sharing analysis procedures. Many linguistic studies are conducted without any coding as well. So that was identified as an issue. And also there's a reluctance to undertake replication studies, although this is really changing, I think, over the past few years, which is great. Lots of special issues in linguistics journals, specifically asking for replications. But still there is this bias. Replications are still somewhat perceived as unoriginal, not prestigious, something you can do as a first paper in a PhD, but afterwards you should get on with some real research. Is still something that can be heard, unfortunately. And in general, the editors, Lukas Oening and Valentin Werner of this special issue, pointed to concerns about high rates of false positive findings in the published literature because we're not conducting replications, and so we're not really so certain as to how robust these findings are. And I would argue that before we can even get to replication, we need to focus on also improving the reproducibility of our research. And so this is a question that I started asking myself a few years ago, like how reproducible is, and I'm focusing on quantitative linguistics research specifically today. So I've conducted some of my own reproductions, which is not so interesting. I would like to focus today on actually reproductions that my students have been conducting, because some 3 years ago I started introducing term paper assignments as reproductions. And so the idea is that I teach a class called data analysis, or a very gentle introduction to statistics and data visualization in R. So I introduce students to data analysis. This is the textbook that I'm working on, which is so it's been elaborated from this class. And it's a class that really takes linguistic students, some of whom have really no experience with any quantitative methods, and also very little experience or in terms of working with programming languages or even manipulating data. So we start with very basic things like types of variables, and we actually start with a spreadsheet program, LibreOffice Calc, because some students are not very familiar with sort of tabular data to start off with. And then we quickly move on to R, so we say goodbye to spreadsheets. We learn how to get started in terms of using a programming language, coding our analysis steps. We also cover data visualization and some inferential statistics as well. And that's what the course contains. And there's a focus as well on reproducibility. I introduce literate programming using Quarto now. It used to be R Markdown, and I moved to Quarto 2 years ago. And the idea here is that the students learn from the very beginning how to make sure that their analysis are reproducible, because they're combining code, text, and code outputs. So that's what the course contains. And during the course itself, we conduct a very partial reanalysis of a published linguistic studies, this one by Eva Dabrowska. That's also the focus of many chapters of the textbook. This is a study that has open data, which is very nice. There's no open code, so that means that that's something that we need to recreate. And as part of the course, we reproduce the descriptive statistics from this paper. And then students who wish to can also produce a term paper as part of this class or at the end of the class. And the assignment there is to reproduce the analysis of a published linguistics paper. So they conduct a reproduction, for which the original data has to be available in some open repository. So it has to be open data. And then they use the methods that's introduced in the course. So we go as far as some basic inferential statistics like t-test, correlation tests, lots of data visualization, but not much more than that. And they focus on examining and explaining, trying to explain any discrepancies that they observe between the results that they obtained and what's published in the paper. And then the term paper itself is to be written as a sort of beginner level tutorial, if you like, and the students who wish to can then revise their their term papers and get them published as well as a case study textbook chapter. And the whole thing has to be done in a reproducible quarter document. So I need to be able to rerun all of the analysis that they conducted on my own computer, and things have to work. So we also ensure that we learn how to do a reproducible analysis. So that's the assignment. And the first challenge, or actually maybe the biggest challenge for this term paper assignment, is actually finding a published linguistics paper that has original data available in open access and that is somewhat accessible to the students as well. So that's the first challenge. I provide a list of papers that I think might be suitable, and some students pick one from this list. But I also highly encourage students to go and look for other papers, just studies they're personally interested in, because this is the great thing about this course. If they are interested in even a very niche subdiscipline of linguistics, they can go and find a paper on this topic they're super interested in and conduct a reproduction of a study in that area. So I try and encourage them to go and look for these papers beyond the list that I provide. And so the result is super interesting because students come up with very, very different studies that they attempt to reproduce. And I'd like to share a few of their results, and so you have an idea of some of the challenges that they face, because things tend to reoccur. And so far, there's no single student or pair of students, they can work as a pair, that has had such an easy job that I thought, oh, this assignment was far too easy. It's never been the case that it was too easy. There's always plenty to look at. So let's start with an example from the first year around this assignment. And now these are Beatrice slides that I'm showing you, because Beatrice conducted this reproduction and also presented the results at a colloquium in Cologne. And Beatrice chose this paper, and as far as I remember, it was a choice that she made. On verbal morphology in L2 Arabic reading. So this was an eye tracking study. And the data was available on IRIS. So IRIS is a database that I encourage students to have a look at. And I think often it's their first choice because it's the database on which the data from the example study, the one that we look at in class, is also on IRIS, so they're familiar with the platform. And IRIS has a lot of sort of second language acquisition studies, and many of my students are particularly interested in that area. So this is where Beatrice got the data from. She attempted to reproduce the descriptive statistics of the fixation measures from the eye tracking data, also of some comparison measures, and then she also reproduced some of the plots. There were some violin plots and graphs with error bars. And this is where things get interesting. Starting with the descriptive statistics, here is from the original paper, and that's the reproduction. And there are a few variables for which means and standard deviation deviate, not by much, but to some extent, and it's a bit unclear why that's the case. It's not also, so all of the students did a lot of forensic work trying to work out what might have happened, and in this case, it's just unclear. There's no clear pattern. We can work it out, but seemingly the data that was being uploaded on IRIS is not quite the same as the one that's actually been used for those published analysis. Close enough, but not quite. And what's strange is actually the reproduction of the violin plots, which should be based on the same data, that was perfect. So it seems that the data that was used in the table is different to the data that was used to produce the plot in the original paper, because this reproduction of the plot seems really exactly the same. So that was interesting. And then this is a paper like many where the data is available, but the code is not available, even though the authors clearly used, it looks like R, to actually do their analysis, but the R code is not available. As a result, it was sometimes quite tricky to work out what was done exactly. And Beatrice spent a lot of time trying to reproduce this plot from the published study, which has some means and then some error bars around those means. But there's no information in the paper about what these error bars represent. And so Beatrice was very surprised to see that this was possible to publish the paper without making clear what is on this plot. So I told her to try various things, and this is what the function looks like in ggplot to create these error bars, and you can have different statistics for the lower and upper bounds. She first tried standard deviation and ended up with much larger bars. That wasn't it. She tried 95% confidence intervals, and they were still much larger, lots of overlap. And then she tried standard error, and that seemed to produce what was expected. And of course, that's interesting because then we end up with no overlap of these error bars that suggests something to the eye and should be made clear, presumably in the method or ideally even in the caption. So this is an example of a study where some reproduction was possible, but it wasn't perfect, and where the data was available, but not the code, and the data didn't quite match what was published. Here's another example from Vanessa this time. Vanessa also picked a paper that she was interested in, that she found herself, because she's very interested in multimodal linguistics, in particular sign language linguistics. So she picked a paper that's essentially a sort of a data paper. It's introducing a norm database, and this is often the type of paper that will have available data for obvious reasons. And as I said, it's not so easy in linguistics to find these papers at the moment, so it's not a surprise. The raw data was actually in the form of Excel sheets, and as you can see, they're not really tidy. So they have these additional rows and things. They were available on the OSF. Vanessa found some interesting slight differences when she tried to reproduce, for instance, these descriptive statistics. Here we have from the original paper, so the raw numbers are all the same, but the paper also had some percentages. And as you can see, all of these percentages have one decimal place, and then the next one is always a 0. And actually, when Vanessa reproduced them, she did find, I mean, they're pretty much nearly the same percentages, but there's something that second digit after the decimal point is not a 0. It's something slightly different. And so the numbers don't quite add up. Maybe a typographical error. We don't know. Did a copy editor add a 0 after every single one of these digits after the decimal point? But the end result is it really doesn't add up to 100, which is strange. So small discrepancy. Other areas of the paper were fully reproducible, like this part here, and as well the plot. So Vanessa managed to reproduce exactly the same plot, which had already been created in R, but the code was not available, and still Vanessa was able to reproduce it exactly. And then there were some other strange things in another aspect of the paper where there were some means and standard deviations reported. And actually, the standard deviations were all considerably larger in the reproduction that Vanessa conducted. And she did some excellent forensic work to work out how these standard deviations had been calculated. And essentially, they were calculated on means of means, which makes the whole thing a bit narrower. Not necessarily wrong per se, but this wasn't clear from the method how these things were calculated. And she also looked at data visualization. This is an original plot from the paper, looking at the data in tabular form, she found this data visualization to be a little bit misleading because, for instance, this box plot is representing, I think, 6 data points or something. So it's not very many. She decided to plot it as bar plots instead, and then we can see that we have not many data points in some categories, and that should inform our understanding of the data set in a different way. Another example from Poppy. This was an interesting paper because, for our purposes, because the data was on trolling. So this is what we're going to be looking at in a second. And the difference with trolling, and Mara will say more, is that it's a curated database. So the authors have to follow certain criteria in order for their data to be to be available on this platform. And so contrary to most other reproduction attempts, Poppy was able to benefit from a README file, which included some information about what the data is about and so on. So there were three files, and the CSV file is the one that she worked from. It's in a tidy format, which is nice. And she set out to reproduce tables because that's what the paper consisted of. It was, yeah, lots of tables, not many other types of some descriptive statistics. And there were no data visualizations, so Poppy created her own. Fortunately, there were some issues with the data. So this is the reproduction of, this is just a copy of what's in the original paper. And there are some zeros which change to other numbers in the reproduction based on the data set that's on trolling. And so the numbers don't quite add up. It's 10 more occurrences of one verb in the data set that's on trolling. And so, of course, this goes on to influence the rest of the analysis. The numbers don't quite add up in various ways. And in such ways that we didn't really understand. So the patterns weren't quite clear as to which data points had been removed, but there are differences. And Poppy's chapter is one that has been revised and is available online. So it's a case study chapter that comes at the end of my textbook. And I encourage you to have a look at it if you're curious to see what happened and the sort of things that Poppy tried to do to work out what went wrong. And a final example of a paper that's also been reproduced, and the chapter is also online. It's by Rose and Gina, and this is a more positive example on the whole, because here the data and code was available on the OSF, and that made things much, much easier for their students. You can see there's an R script. The data is available as a CSV. There were some issues in rerunning the author's code, some things that can be found, a few lines that were missing, a few things that weren't necessary were still there, were simply removed. But on the whole, things did run. And so it was an overall success. The difference being, compared to the last project, there was no README file. And so as a result, some issues in terms of interpreting the raw data, because, lots of column names are quite abstract. And so there were a few issues in this respect. But because the code was available, they could see what happened. It was just difficult to understand why that was the case. The availability of a README file would have been very helpful. And they also found the analysis script somewhat difficult to navigate. It was partially annotated, but of course, when it's someone completely new to the project, it's helpful if it's really in detail. And this case study reproduction is also available already to have a look at. So I have many more examples I could give you from students' work, but I think some of the things sort of come up time and time again. And sort of our key takeaways are quite similar to what Britta and colleagues put forward in looking at how to improve the reproducibility and rigor of biomedical research. I've just taken over this plot and I've just changed it to linguistics, and it works just as well. I think all of these aspects are really, really important. So starting with, of course, having open data and metadata, using open source software and sharing the code and sharing exact methods, having the sort of platforms to be able to share workflows and annotations, using reproducible tools and workflows, but also, and this is where it goes sort of round, having journal policies that actually implement these things that require reproducible research, where reviewers are encouraged to have a look at the code and the data, where funding agencies also require this to happen. And I think this is the bit that we really shouldn't forget, where we have the computational training for linguists to be able to do this sort of stuff. So acquiring these skills, and I have found that integrating this as a term paper assignment is a great way to get students to think about these things and to realize that it's not that simple. Just sharing your data and code in and of itself is not necessarily enough. So yeah, I'll end my half of the talk here for now. I just want to say a huge thank you to the students whose work I showed you, and there are many others who've done some great work in this endeavor. And I would also like to thank the authors of the papers whose finding we reproduced because they shared their data and sometimes their code and often replied to our emails. And this is unfortunately not the norm in linguistics, so it's all very easy to criticize the work of colleagues who've actually put in the effort to share their data and their code. And so a huge thank you to them. I think we can all learn from some of the challenges that students faced in reproducing their work, but a great step forward. So a huge thank you to both students and authors. And now I'll hand over to Mara.
Yeah, let me share my presentation. There we go. Yeah, so to kind of follow up on all the stuff you've heard in the last part of the presentation, I'll present trolling. So my name is Mara. I work at the university in Tromsø in Norway, where I work amongst others with trolling. So that's the Tromsø Repository of Language and Linguistics, which in my, of course, slightly biased opinion is a great place to both find data for reproducing studies, but also to put your own data that you might have collected. So yeah, trolling is an open access repository for all linguistics data and related materials. As I mentioned, it's operated at the University of Tromsø. We're also part of the Clarence Center, or we are that. And the great part, anyone who wants to put their linguistics data on trolling can do that for free. So who are we at Trolling? The people who work with Trolling are Helene, Philip, Hugh, and myself. So if you would deposit your data with us, you would get an email from one of us when we curate your data. And of course, if you have any questions, you can also send any of us an email. I always think it's nice, when you put your data somewhere to kind of have a face to the repository, to see that we're just humans and we just want to help you. We're not scary at all. So a little bit about the data that we have on trolling. As of now, we have around 230 published data sets that are from a big number of authors, so 234 contributing authors from over 100 research organizations from many different countries in the world. And so far we have over 60,000 file downloads. So that is also great because that kind of shows that people also use the data that we have on our repository, which of course is the purpose of having the data available. So what type of data do we have on trolling? We have a lot. So this is just really some examples. We have quite a lot of corpus data. We also have a lot of experimental data. So for example, we have eye tracking studies. We have studies that are about a bunch of different languages. And then, of course, the combination of all of this. So I would recommend to definitely check out trolling, see if there's anything there that might be relevant for your research. So apart from, of course, using data from trolling, the question is also, why should you put your data on trolling? Why would you use us? What's in it for you? Well, first of all, a lot of journals, universities, funders these days require that your data is openly available. So in that sense, it is great to do that on trolling, right? So sometimes it's just something you have to do. Of course, we also always say, just be a good human, give back to the community. We are also a domain-specific repository. So as I mentioned, we do linguistics or language-related data, which the general recommendation is if you put your data somewhere, put it in a domain-specific repository. Of course, you can also put it on, for example, like in a lot of countries, they have Dataverse, right? Also a great place to put your data, but that is for any research data, whereas trolling is specifically for language data. So that's also a great advantage. And as was already mentioned before, we curate your data set. So we make sure that it's as fair as possible, right? As findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable as possible. I'll get into this curation a bit more later, but that is a huge benefit. And as I mentioned, it's all free. So you basically get free help to make your data as fair as possible. We're also rather fast. We aim to give you feedback within 3 working days. Of course, we keep the data accessible and safe long term, right? That's also really important. You don't want to put your data somewhere and then a year later, the repository doesn't exist anymore, or the data can't be found. That would be a waste of the work that you've put into both collecting your data and to making it available. And we are also peer review friendly, which means that we can make you a private URL to share with editors or reviewers prior to publication. So when you submit your article, you can then add this private URL link, which will lead to an anonymized version of your data set, so that the reviewers can also take a look at your data. Without, of course, then knowing who you are. So that is also a great benefit that we have at trolling. So what does it actually look like? You already saw a tiny little example in the last presentation, but this is what a data set looks like on trolling. So this is kind of the overview page, right, where you immediately see how to cite the data set, the title, the abstract, and you also see under which license the data set is published. And then there's a little tab with all the files. As you see, also the README file, which I'll also come back to, very important. That's kind of the manual for your data set. We add a lot of metadata, right? So things like the languages, the software you might need, the keywords. If you have your data from other sources, again, you can refer there. So it's a really great way to make the data also kind of findable in search engines, for example. And of course, if you want to use the data, it's a great way to kind of skim through and see if the data would be relevant for your own project. And that also means that we can do this great bidirectional referencing. So in the data availability statement in your article, you can refer to your data set on trolling, right? You get a DOI for your data set, and then on trolling in the metadata field, you can refer to your related publication, right? So then it also becomes this really nice loop where it's very clear what belongs together. Of course, I already mentioned it briefly, but yeah, we aim to make your data as fair as possible. And the way we do that is that we work with preferred file formats. So open, non-proprietary file formats to make sure that there's a long-term readability, right? So for example, we don't want you to upload something as an Excel file, but rather as a CSV file, right? Not a Word document, but a TXT file, for example. There's also the obligatory documentation. So that is, as I mentioned before, the README file and the metadata, very important. As we just heard, it is rather difficult to try and replicate a study if you only have the data, right? You don't know anything, right? It's basically trying to assemble this huge Lego structure without knowing what you're building or which little brick goes where. So the README file, very important. And that also means that any data you'll find on trolling will have a README file that us, the curators, will have also read through to make sure that it really is understandable. Because often, you know, when it's your own project, you're like, yeah, sure, everyone gets this because you're so kind of focused on it, but maybe not everyone understands it. So that's also something we help you with. And then we also have the option to add additional metadata, right? So very domain-specific metadata, for example, that might be relevant for linguistics data. And we have, of course, the licenses that I just showed you, right? Like, so for every data set, it will tell you under what license it is published. So the default is a CC0 license, right? That means that it's dedicated to the public domain. But sometimes when people use data from a corpus, then we have to use a different kind of license because of the corpus that they've gotten their data from. But that's also something that you wouldn't have to worry about. It's something that that we know about. But of course, it means once you're going to use data from trolling, you always have to check under what license something is published. And then you get the persistent identifiers, which is great, right? Like to kind of refer to your data set in other places. And having the metadata in place and the way we are kind of set up means that your data set will also be indexed by other websites and by search engines. So yeah, using trolling, you make sure that your data is as fair as possible. So what does it look like, or how does it work if you would submit your data to trolling? This looks rather scary maybe, but it's really not. Because you start by preparing your data, right? You want to make sure that you've cleaned your data, that you've written your README file, that you've added your metadata. And these are all things that if you have written a data management plan and you've stuck to it, this should not be a lot of work. So you start by preparing your data. Then you put it on trolling, right? You fill out all the fields, you upload your files, and then you click submit. And that's when it comes to us, the curators. We then go through your data set. We check, you know, have all the metadata fields been filled out? Is there anything missing? Is there anything that could be phrased better? You know, sometimes people will write the description of their data set, they'll write 2 sentences. Then I would say, oh, can you give me a bit more information? And we'll look through your files to make sure that they're the correct format. We'll look through your README file to make sure that all the information is there, that it's clear. And then usually we have a few suggestions to make the data set more fair, right? So then we'll send it back to you with a little report saying like, hey, maybe, you know, add this or change this. And then, you know, you as the author of your data, you work on that and then you send it back to us. And then usually after 1 or 2 rounds of that, your data set is ready to be published, which is always great. So then it is available for anyone. And then you can also refer to your data set in articles, you know, maybe on GitHub, anywhere that you want. And then, of course, if you want, you can always update your data set. So maybe you collect more data that you want to add, or maybe when your data set was published, the article that belonged to it wasn't out yet, but now it is. So you update the metadata to include this article, right? Just some updates. You can always you can always do. So that's what that looks like. So very important when you prepare your data, make sure if you've collected data from participants that you have the correct consent, right? If in your consent form you've written down that data is going to be deleted after or destroyed after the project, or if you've explicitly said that the data will not be published openly, then we can't, right? So it's important to also upload your consent. And of course, yeah, as I mentioned, describe your data, write the README file, but we have a template for that. So we try and make it as easy as possible. Then to actually get it on trolling, right, you create an account on the website. And this is what it would look like to fill out the metadata. So it's very straightforward. It's just all these boxes that you fill out. And of course, that's also, you know your data best. So it is what you think makes sense for your data. Then very easy to upload your files. You can upload sort of single files, but if you have a lot of files, you can also upload them in a folder structure so that when people download your data, it is downloaded with all the folders that you put it in. So that also makes it very easy for big data sets. And then, of course, always great to submit something because then it's out of your hands and then it's someone else's problem, at least for a little bit. So that is kind of the process. It is really, and that's the nice thing, right, about it being curated. We are here to help you. If you would put your data, for example, on OSF or Zenodo, it might be a lot faster because no one's going to check it. You can just like all upload it and then be done with it. But the chances of people actually reusing your data, I would say, are a lot lower because, no one, you might not, you don't even need to add a README file. And as we discovered, it's very hard to reproduce something without a README file. So you might technically adhere to having your data openly available, but if no one's going to use it, then what's the point of having it out there, right? Then it is just taking up space on some server, and environmentally speaking, that is not a great thing to do. So I would say even if you choose to not go for trolling, that is absolutely fine, but find a repository that is curated. Find a repository where there is actual support staff that can help you make your data as fair as possible. So yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to tell, and I thought it would be great if we had some time for discussions or for questions, rather than me giving you a very long talk. So let me stop sharing my screen. There we go. But also, of course, if you have questions for Ellen, like any questions, we'll be happy to take and any discussions as well.